it talked about creating a conflict between the Muslim world and what it called political Zionism. And people will say, well, that's got to be a fake because there was no Zionism when that letter was supposed to be written. Well, this is an agenda that's projected a long way forward. This is why Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and Eric Blair, George Orwell, 1984, who knew each other. Huxley taught George Orwell French at Eton College, where the royals go, and they knew each other and they became friends. And from the same sources, not least the Fabian Society in Britain, they understood the projected agenda. And we're talking there in 1932 that Huxley's book was published, 1948 that Orwell's book was published, and they are describing the society that's unfolding today at that time. And there are many, many other examples of people predicting the future who were insiders who have turned out to be incredibly accurate. So the idea that Albert Pike would know that this Zionist movement was coming and the establishment of Israel was coming is very credible when you look at the background evidence. And of course, Zionism was established not that long after this letter was supposed to be written. And so he was talking about the Muslim world being brought into a war with the political Zionism, what today we call Israel, and that this would, you know, in my terms, create a vortex that would draw in the world, in our terms, America, the European Union, NATO, into this war. And what you have now is a situation that this ISIS group has come out of nowhere, in effect, incredibly well armed, incredibly funded. I mean, I've seen figures like $2 billion at its disposal. And it's walking into towns in Iraq and taking them over. It's established itself at the key border crossings into Syria and into Jordan. And it's all happened really fast. And what the potential of this clearly is to do what Pike was talking about. Because I've said in my books for years that the plan was to create a massive divide and rule conflict between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. I mean, I know it's hard to believe for anyone frickin' sane, but this argument over, this ancient argument over who should, you know, be the natural successor to, the rightful successor to Muhammad and all that stuff, has created this enormous schism. And schisms are there to be manipulated and exploited by these people. So what you have, therefore, is this ISIS that suddenly appeared with its grotesque violence that is representing Sunni Muslims. And then you have the regime currently in Iraq that is representing, in effect, Shia Muslims. And you have, just across the border, the center of the Shia Muslim world, and that's Iran. Iran, 89%, I think it is, of Iranian Muslims are Shia. Now, in the last little while, there's been this, apparently on the face of it, this strange change of direction by America in terms of Iran. They've spent all these years with Israel saying, well, you know, we must take out their nuclear facilities and these sanctions against them, and all they're terrible. And now, if you remember, in the last week or so, they've even been talking about maybe they ought to get into discussions with Iran and come to some agreement on how they deal with this ISIS situation. And it's like, what? Yeah. But when you come from this perspective, what they're doing is they're trying to draw Iran into this Sunni Shia conflict, like, you know, protect the Shia that this Sunni ISIS are threatening and overrunning at the moment. And once they get Iran pulled into that vortex, it ain't going to get out. Yep. Then there's another aspect of this, which is a real red flag for me. And that is, this ISIS organization is very extreme. And its very name, when you break down the wording, is describing its ambitions. And that's to take over Iraq, to take over Syria, and to take over what they call the Levant. And what does the Levant include? Israel. So here you have this extreme Muslim group, or actually the army, actually saying in its own name that our intention is to take over the Levant, to take over Israel. And you'd think at any other time, even with a lesser situation, Netanyahu would be surrounded by microphones and he'd be saying, we must be protected, Israel is in danger. Instead, he's come out and said, oh, no problem, you leave them to it. America, no, don't intervene, leave them to it, let them basically weaken each other. And then you've got the United States, their reaction. I mean, it sums up the ludicrous nature of it, that John Kerry has gone to Iraq and he said, well, we know about bloody airstrikes because, you know, we might kill civilians. Well, that's never stopped you in the past, mate, has it? Or any of your predecessors. And what it seems to me as I'm reading this is that they're all standing off to let this ISIS get a big foothold in that region. And then if it moves to the point where it starts to threaten Israel, then the button will be pressed. Then the Americans and NATO will come in because they're committed to protecting Israel's security. And then you'll start to see why that sliver of land called Israel, with less than 8 million people, has one of the best equipped armies in the world and a nuclear arsenal. Yeah. Because what Pike was talking about was drawing all these different disparate groups in and creating this vortex of mutual self-destruction, which would change the war that would change the world, taking on from the previous world wars that changed the world, and then at that point their global fascist society would be brought in. No doubt justified by, we need a world government and we need a world army to stop this ever happening again, even though we who are saying that actually created it. And then you've got what I've been saying now way back in the 1990s. The idea is for this Third World War to involve Russia and China against the West. Yeah.
Oceania versus Eurasia, yeah.
Yeah, in the 1984 kind of scenario. And what you have now is the demonization of Russia. Have you noticed that? How suddenly we got the demonization of Russia? And what's opening up in the Ukraine, while all this is starting to go on in the Middle East, is another front against Russia. Because, you know, it's very easy to see how Russia can be pulled into this Middle Eastern conflict by supporting Syria, because destroying Syria is part of ISIS's agenda and American agenda and NATO's agenda.
And also Iran as well.
Yeah, and destroying Iran, yeah. So, and Russia would come out in support of Iran, and the same would happen with China. And so you can see how it's how the pieces in the game are being moved around to create this scenario that Pike talked about. A close aide of President Putin, who has special responsibility for Ukraine, has actually said this week that the United States is preparing for a war against Russia through Ukraine, and that what they plan is to try to take Crimea back. Now, you can have the odd bit of terrorism and bad things happen in Ukraine to Russian supporting people, and Putin can stay back and hold his fire because he knows what they're trying to manipulate him into. But if they try to take Crimea back, Putin's ego and Putin's pride will no way I would strongly suspect, allow him just to let them do it.
Exactly.
And therefore, that if they try to take Crimea back, then what you're looking at is a war, or a calculated war against Russia.
Yeah.
And if you start a front against Russia on its borders, and then all this stuff going on in the Middle East, you are diluting Russia's impact on what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's all a setup. And when you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are 51st states of the United States, there are many of those, mind, funding this ISIS and funding this terrorism, while the Americans, who could tell them to stop any time, are saying, are condemning the very terrorism that their 51st states are supporting. Well, the picture's so bloody obvious. It's a setup, and it's a setup to attempt to trigger World War III.